Hello, and welcome to How to Beat Your Kids at Board Games. We're glad you're listening, and you're in for a treat. A quick announcement before we get started. The episode you're about to hear was among the first we recorded, back when our only recording equipment was the humble Voice Memos app on the still humbler iPhone 6s. Thus, while we are proud of the content, we realize that the sound quality may not be the best. If you find the episode hard to listen to for this reason, we recommend checking out one of our later episodes, starting with Episode 6, Battleship Blitz, in which we had acquired our state-of-the-art podcasting microphones. In any case, we do hope that at some point, when you have a bit more peace and quiet, you'll come back and listen to this one. We're sure you'll love it. All right, enough chit-chat, let's get to the episode.
Hello everybody, this is John.
And this is Dan.
And we are here today to talk to you about how to beat your kids at board games. Last time we talked about Monopoly. We told you some strategies to get the most bang for your buck in that classic game. And Dan, what are we going to be talking about today?
Today we are going to be talking about Parcheesi, also known as the classic game of India. So first, before we get into actual gameplay, we're going to go over a little bit of the origins of this awesome game. So while the West, we in the West, or wherever you're listening to, you might not be in the West, but here it's known as Parcheesi, but the game has ancestry in India under the name Parcheesi, similar enough, but that game has an ancestor called Chaupar, and a fun little anecdote about this guy is the Mughal Emperor Akbar, sorry Star Wars fans, that's Akbar, actually played this game, this ancestor of Parcheesi, with real people in his garden. So if you ever get to the point where you have so many friends where they would just play a game of Parcheesi and be your pawns, then you are kind of ballin'. Of course, Emperor Akbar played with members of his harem, so don't do that. But yeah, and Parcheesi also has some variants in the West as well as other parts of the world. So in the U.S. here we have Aggravation, just a game called India, and you may have played Sorry as a kid or Trouble. And in Germany we've got Der Weg zur Herberge. United Kingdom we've got Piggyback, Homeward Bound, Parcheesi, and Ludo. Anyway, so all these variants are really cool, but today we're just going to talk about Parcheesi in its classic form. So without further ado, let's get started.
All right, and Parcheesi at first seems like a simple game because all you do is roll dice and move your pieces up, but there are several mechanics, several rules introduced in the game that make your choice a lot more difficult. So we're going to talk a little bit about those. I think we're going to start off with one, forced moves.
Yeah, so actually these ones make your decision easier because so a few things with forced moves. One, you have to make a move if possible. You can't pass like you can in some games. When you roll fives, you have to enter a pawn if possible.
And why don't you explain?
Let's back up.
Give me a little terminology. What do you mean by entering a pawn?
All right. So, first of all, like we say on all of our podcasts, if you're unfamiliar with this game, you should probably go look it up or play a game or two with someone before you listen to our podcast, because while we do go through the rules, I think you'll get a lot more out of it if you've actually had a chance to play it yourself.
And we aren't going through all the rules either.
Right.
We're not going to sit here and tell you exactly what's going on because that would just take too long.
Right. So just kind of the noteworthy things that even if you played a game or two, if you didn't read the instructions carefully, you may have played it wrong. So
I know I have.
Yeah. We definitely, looking at these, we've definitely played these wrong too. So first we're going to talk about forced moves.
And that would just be any move where, say, you roll something on the dice, you have to take a particular action, right?
Exactly. So everybody starts off the game with 4 pawns in their starting area. And to get onto the board, you must roll a 5. Now, this is either one of your dice shows 5, and you roll 2 dice, or the sum of the 2 dice is 5. So a 2 and a 3, for example. So, yeah, if you roll a 5 on one of your dice, then you must use that 5 to move a pawn out.
And this applies even once you have pawns on the board, right? It's not just in the beginning of the game.
Exactly. So let's say you have 3 of your pawns out on the board and you roll a 5 and you would like to move one of your pawns out on the board 5 spaces. Well, it turns out you can't. You have to take the one that's in your start and you have to get it out onto the board with that 5. So another corollary to this is if you have a pawn already on your starting space, so that is the space on the board right outside your starting area, if you roll double 5s, you can't move that guy 5 spaces and then move 2 more of your pawns out. You can only move.
Well, you just move one out because you've already used one.
You have to move. You can only use one of those 5s. You can't use them both.
And you forfeit your second 5.
You forfeit your second 5.
Kind of an edge case. It's not something that's going to happen often, and so they have a specific rule just for this scenario.
Exactly, and that is something that I and many friends have played wrong until this very day when we were looking this up. So. Consider yourself educated.
We weren't looking this up the day of, by the way. We were doing this research weeks before.
Yeah,
I've been eating, sleeping, and breathing
at
Parcheesi.
least the night before, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so speaking of doubles, Parcheesi calls them doublets, and we don't actually know why that is, why every other game seemingly known to man calls them doubles, but here they're called doublets. But here's something cool you need to know about doublets. So first of all, if you still have pawns in your starting area, doublets are just the same as any other roll. Namely, you can take one pawn and move it. Let's say you roll double 2s. One pawn and move it 2, and another pawn and move it 2. Or you can move one pawn 4, the sum of those 2. And the only special thing about doubles in that case is you get to roll again if you roll doubles. Now, if you have all of your pawns out on the board and you roll doublets, here's where it gets cool. You get to use both the tops and the bottom of the dice. So let's say you rolled double 6. You have 6, 6, 1, and 1 that you can move. And you can split it any way you want between your 4 pawns out on the board, of course, as long as it's a 6, a 6, a 1, and a 1, and not like a 4 and a 3 or something like that. And an interesting thing here is if you can't use the whole 14, that's what any combination will get. If you roll doubles, the tops and the bottoms will always add up to 14. So if you can't use the whole 14, you can't use any of them. You've just got to roll again.
Right, and so an easy way to remember, like you said, is if you roll double 1s, the other side has to add up to 14, or each die has to add up to 7. So 1 6, 2 is paired with 5, 3 and 4. That's an easy way to remember it.
Exactly. And so final note on doublets, if you roll 3 in a row, you really, really don't want to do this, by the way. Not only do you lose the rest of your turn, so you can't move that doubles the third time you roll it, but you also have to take your farthest advanced pawn, no matter where it is, unless it's already in home, and you have to move it back into your starting area. So this applies even if you're on the safe zone, which we'll talk about later, or if you're on a safety space, which we will also talk about later. So really don't want to roll 3 doubles in a row, not that you can help it, but just keep that in mind.
And granted, you got about a 1 in 200 chance of doing that, so it's not going to come up too often, but hey, it might happen to someone.
It might happen to someone, and you need to laugh in their face when it does, because if it happens to them, it probably won't happen to you in the same game.
That's just false, but we can talk about that another time.
It's equally likely whether it happens to your friend or not. But anyway, so there's a couple more rules we want to go through. Blockades is our next one. So this is a fun one. Actually, I skipped one, so there's 3 more. So, but let's talk about blockades.
I'm
first.
seeing that you skipped 2.
Oh my!
Skip both captures and safety spaces.
Okay, so let's talk about captures.
Yeah, captures are a big one.
Okay, so simple enough. If you make a roll and one of your pawns can exactly land on your opponent's pawn, with that roll, you can capture your opponent's pawn with an asterisk. We'll get into that in a second. And when you do, you get a free 20 spaces for any of your pawns out on the board to move. So what you do basically is you make this capture. So let's say you rolled a 2 and a 3 and your opponent's pawn is 3 spaces away. So you take your 1 pawn, you move 3, you capture that pawn. Then what you have to do is you have to move your 2 with, whatever other pawn you were going to do. And then you get 20 to close out your turn. Now, if you cannot move the 20 spaces on that turn, you don't have enough real estate, or someone's blocking you, or you just don't have pawns on the board, then you forfeit that 20 spaces. You can't hold it on for the next turn or whatever.
Right.
So yeah.
And then
that's the mechanic of captures, essentially.
And safety spaces are just a space. If your pawn is on that space, you can't be captured by any other pawn. So, and what happens if someone would land on the same space? Are they unable to make that move?
Yeah, they cannot land on the safety space if your pawn is occupying it.
Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
That's great. But they can move past it. Unlike a blockade, which we're going to talk about next. But real quickly, though, the safe spaces are designated by either a lotus flower on them, or they're usually a different color. Real easy to pick out. Your instructions will be very clear on which spaces are safety spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and then of course each player has their home row, which is the 8, I think, squares before home.
Mm-hmm.
And if your pawn is in that row, it cannot be captured by anyone. They can't move into your home row and take you, for example.
Ooh, big problem here. Only 7.
Seven
including
spaces.
1 safe space on the end, but that's for everyone.
1 safe space on the end that everyone can use, and then 7 safe spaces which only you, the player, can use. Usually this is your same color, but on some board games it's not. It's just one uniform color. So that's safety spaces. So yeah, if you're on a safety space, you can't be captured by your opponent. But if you roll doubles, if that's your farthest one out, you still have to move it back. So again, don't roll doubles 3 times in a row. Okay, now we're going to talk about blockades. So you are able to put 2 of your pawns on the same square or game space. No more than 2, but up to 2. So basically, if you've got 2 pawns on a game space, nobody can capture those 2 pawns, and nobody can move past those 2 pawns on the board.
Including yourself.
Including your own pawns, exactly. So this has some strategic implications that we're going to talk about later, but for now, just know that's what a blockade is. It's 2 of your same pawns on one space.
And you can't move, say you were to get doubles, you can't move both pieces up at the same time so that they would still be in a blockade. Exactly.
You can't just advance your blockade together, because that would be no fun, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
So last thing is just home, talking about getting a pawn into home. So once you advance a pawn into that area, you get an extra 10 spaces. And in order, and again, if you can't move the 10 spaces with any of the pawns on the board, you forfeit it. It doesn't come back.
Mm-hmm.
And then one final note on home, you have to exactly get the right number in order to move your pawn into home. So if you're 1 square away and you get a 2, no dice.
Mm-mm. Well, 2 dice.
2 dice.
None for you.
No luck. Except bad luck. Anyway. So
now we can move on to a little bit more strategy. Now that we talked about the rules that make Parcheesi what it is, and not just a simple, it's what separates Parcheesi from Candyland.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of decisions that you're making every turn. Even though your turn just depends on how well you roll dice, right? You still have to decide which piece to move and how many spaces to move it. So because you can either split your dice up between two different pieces that you have, or you can have one piece go the sum of the two dice. So
Right.
that's kind of what your strategy is going to be based on. That's where you're making your decisions. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is kind of the power of the blockade and when to do it and when not to do it.
So, I, having not really read up on this subject, but just from personal experience, think that if your opponent uses a blockade, I kind of start to hate them a little bit. I
can confirm this. Yeah.
If nothing else, it's just really annoying to your opponents that they can't move. However, also in my personal experience, no blockade lasts forever. And once you break up that blockade, especially if it has been, a thorn in the side of your opponents, I think they're going to be really eager to capture you if they get the chance after that. Even more eager than they always, almost eager enough to maybe play a little bit irrationally for their own benefit at your expense.
Right.
So,
and guess what? They're going to be very likely to capture you after you break a blockade because they'll be pushed up against your blockade. You'll have to break it up
from behind.
You have to break it up. You can't move both of them forward at the same time, which means either you're moving up both of your pieces by less than 6, which, as we'll talk about in a minute, is a danger zone.
Yeah.
Or you're moving one of your pieces up by more than 6, hopefully, unless you rolled poorly.
Right.
But then you leave one piece right next to all of your opponent's pieces. So, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, the takeaway here is you only want to blockade when it's getting you something substantial that is more than just making your opponents angry, because that can come back to bite you. And one way in which this is true is, let's say you have 3 pawns out on the board and you have the opportunity to make a blockade with your back 2. And let's say that all of your opponent's pawns are behind those back 2 of yours. So basically, if you do this blockade here with your back 2, then your pawn out in front has a clear path, unobstructed, to home. Nobody can come out and get in front of this guy or get right behind this guy and be able to take him, because they have to advance all the way around the board. And in order to do that, they would have to pass your blockade, which they can't. So if you give your own guy a free path, that's one reason to do a blockade.
Yeah, because you can never underestimate how big it is to get one of your pieces into your safe 7 spaces.
Right.
That is just huge. You have the first person to do that has a huge advantage over everyone else. Not just in that they've completed one phase of the game, basically. I mean, eventually they'll get that piece in, unless they're very unlucky. Whereas when your pieces are not safe, they could theoretically go around indefinitely. Your pieces could almost never make it in. Whereas once they're in the safe spaces, they're pretty much guaranteed to get in at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, unless you do the 1 in 200 roll 3 doublets in a row.
Right. So it's almost, and even in this scenario, anytime you do a blockade, you can think of it as sacrificing one of your pieces.
Exactly.
That's, I think, what you need to consider is it worth sacrificing one of my pieces to get one of my pieces in? And if the blockade isn't going to guarantee that you get one of your pieces to safety, it's probably not worth it.
Unless you just happen to move those 2, and for one turn they're there, and then maybe the next turn, you're making a blockade, but you're not actually keeping it.
Right. There's some weird, there's some edge cases, definitely, that you're going to have to look at and say, okay, I might actually have a safe path here where, things will work out. Also, in the case where, there are cases where you can move one of your blockade pieces up by 7 or more, capture a piece, and then move your other one up by 20. So you save both of your pieces at the same time. So there are cases where it'll work out. But in general, I think you should be okay with sacrificing a piece every time you make a blockade.
Yeah.
Or every time you keep a blockade for several turns.
Right, exactly. So in other words, you shouldn't make a blockade unless you're okay with sacrificing a piece. And for me, like basically the only reason I would ever do that is if I knew that I was going to definitely get one of my pawns into home or into my safe space.
Even in the scenario, so say you're behind, another player has 2 pieces already in home, but you have the opportunity to block both of their other pieces with your blockade, but it won't get you anything else.
Sure.
There are also other people's pieces behind your blockade.
Right.
So there's a chance that the winning player pieces get captured.
Right.
While they're sitting behind your blockade.
Yep.
Is it worth it at that point?
I mean, I think it depends on a lot of things, but it could be worth it. I mean, I think if you have other pieces on the board, I suppose you're saying like maybe you don't have other pieces that they're about to go to home.
Right.
I suppose if you just allow this winning player's pieces to be taken, you gain yourself valuable time. And so you have to ask yourself, is that worth sacrificing a piece? I think it's affected by like where your own pieces are on the board, how close they are to home. So another thing we want to talk about is like how distance to home makes a difference in things in your decisions, but we can get to that later. What do you think?
So my thinking is that it would really depend on whether you see the winning player's piece getting captured in a few turns. So if you think that other players' pieces would start to pile up on your blockade first, with the we'll call him player X, with player X's piece getting there last and having less of a chance of getting captured, I don't think it's worth it. I think you're doing this blockade to achieve a certain goal.
Right.
You're risking that it'll happen. Sure. But you don't want to make a bad bet. You don't want to bet on something that's not likely to happen.
Yeah. So definitely like if the winning player's pieces, like so everybody's pieces are behind your pieces, right? But if the winning player's pieces are behind the other player's pieces, then you don't want to blockade because then the winning player's pieces are likely the ones that end up still on the board at the end of this and in prime position to take yours rather than
the other way around.
Right. So, and again, like I think there is maybe a little bit of a human element here. Because like I said earlier, I think if you're really pissed off that somebody's blocking your pieces, then once they break that blockade, even if you maybe have a better move, if you have the opportunity to take one of their pieces, you might just do it out of spite. Because again, like you're not playing against robots, you're playing against humans, just like, common theme throughout a lot of our podcasts. I think if the players are more appreciative of the fact that you just blocked the winning player's pieces from advancing, then they might be a little bit less vindictive against you and probably be more likely to play rational, which means they might end up taking you, but they won't take you just out of spite. Right. Most likely. I mean, some people are just jerks, but
right. So then that's one thing you gain is that if other players in the game are aware that you're making this blockade so that you can take down the top player. Yeah. You're gonna win some favor. You might even be able to get people to not take you. Right. Just out of being nice. Right. If it works out, and the other players don't lose too much time, whatever. Obviously, if you keep them behind your blockade forever, they're probably going to be pissed, regardless of what happens in the game. But you can turn these things to your advantage. Exactly. If you're working the people in the room. Yeah. Exactly. And it's almost kind of like a gentleman's strategy, almost, if that's even a thing. Right. Yeah. So anything else on blockades? No, I think that about covers it.
Cool. Okay, so now we have a fun part, and we're going to talk more in depth about captures.
And when he says fun,
it depends on what side you're coming from.
He's talking about stats.
I think stats are fun.
And we think stats are fun. Yeah. Most people probably don't. Just safe bet there, I think. Sure. But we'll try to give it to you in the most entertaining way possible. Exactly. In the way that tells you how to win.
Exactly. So even if you don't think stats are fun, you should still listen, because if you're listening to this podcast at all, you probably think games are fun and that winning games
is even more
fun. So the stats that we will give you right now will be in a nice digestible format that you can apply toward your game winning strategy in the future. Mm-hmm. So without further ado, go ahead.
All right. So the main statistics that you're going to employ in this game is your knowledge of the double dice roll and the ability to split dice. So it's very easy to look up. You just look up, table of 2 consecutive dice rolls, and you'll be able to see a nice square table of every possible pair. Every pair is equally likely. And so from this table, you can get all sorts.
So in other words, you are equally likely to roll a 2 and a 4 at the same time as you are, for example, a 3 and a 4, or a 3 and a 5, or whatever.
Yeah. So stop me if I use any lingo or go too fast. But basically, we can know how likely it is for you to get any combination of dice, and therefore how likely you are to make certain moves. Mm-hmm. And so through this, we can figure out which spaces are the most safe. Now, the easiest example, or the most simple example, is to think about how likely are you to be able to get a piece out of your starting area.
Right.
To do this, you have to roll a 5 or a combination that adds up to 5. Now, the table that we have would suggest that your probability of doing so is roughly 4 plus 11 over 36. So 15 over 36, which is a little bit less than half. Yep. So on any given turn, you're a little bit less than 50% chance, likely.
Yes. 5/12.
Yeah. And so any roll, you're going to get a piece out every 2 or 3 turns. Is what you should expect. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that say you're trying to capture a piece, or conversely, you're in front of your opponent's piece and you want to know how far in front to be safe. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, the most that someone can go under normal circumstances is 12. So if you're more than 12 spaces ahead, great, you're probably safe.
Yeah.
Now, I would also not want to be 14 spaces ahead, because there is a 1/6 chance that they roll doublets, in which case they could take you with their 14 spaces. Sure. So, but we're just going to consider, how far away do you want to be? 1 space to 12 spaces.
Yep.
If you're in this danger zone, where do you want to be? Now, what the table tells us is that you do not want to be within 6 spaces.
Right.
Because not only can they use the sum of their dice, but they can also use individual die to get you. Whereas if you're 7 or more spaces away, they have to add up their dice to take you.
Right.
Yeah.
So in other words, if you're 6 spaces away and they roll, a 4 and a 6, they can take you. But they can also take you if they roll a 4 and a 2, or a 1 and a 5, etc. So if you look at the table, it makes it really clear. But basically, if you're 6 spaces away, the chance that they are able to take you on the next turn is almost 1/2.
Right. 16 out of 36.
Yep.
So you do not want to be 6 spaces away. However, if you're setting up to take a piece, you really do want to be 6 spaces away.
Oh, yeah.
And this also comes in handy when you're trying to get home. So if you have the opportunity to move, to split your dice, move one of your pieces so that it's 6 spaces away from home, and then move another piece forward somewhere else on the board, you should probably do so, because that'll give you the highest chance of putting that piece into home earlier.
Yep. And cashing in on your 10 spaces.
Right. Yeah. And so that's kind of where the probability of rolling comes in. It's all about setting yourself up for success and failure by knowing how likely your opponents are to roll what they need to roll.
Yeah.
It doesn't take too much math, but just general rules go that moving your piece up 1 to 6 spaces is more likely than
having the opportunity to move 1 to 6 spaces.
Yeah.
Right.
Is going to come up a lot more often than having an opportunity to move your piece 7 or more spaces.
Right.
And also, there's kind of an inverse thing. So you're more likely to be able to move your piece 6 spaces than you are to move it 1 space.
Right.
And it kind of descends, and it descends on either side of 6 or 7.
Right. So basically, if a piece is 1 square away from yours, you're pretty likely that is like 11 out of 36, right? 11 out of 36 to take it. If they're 2 spaces away, that increases to 12 out of 36. 3 spaces, 13 out of 36, etc. And then when you get to 6, you're like 16 out of 36, like chance to take that piece on the next turn. In contrast, when you get up to 7, that drops off sharply to, I think,
1 out of 6.
To 1 out of 6. And then, 8 away is
5 out of
5 out of 36. Then 9 is 4 out of 36, etc. So basically, from 1 to 6, your odds increase, with the increasing dice, and then they drop off. And then from 7 to 12, they decrease.
Right.
Yeah.
So
basically, getting out of that 1 to 6 range is probably the most important thing if you're thinking about how not to be taken on the next turn.
Right. If you have to be within the 1 and 6 range, you should pick 1.
Yeah, or the lower one.
The lowest, closest you can be. If you and that is debatable too, because you'll be closer for next turn as well.
Sure.
But in general, if you're thinking about just am I going to get captured next turn, you want to be closer to them. However, if you have to be, anywhere from 1 or 12 spaces in front of someone, you want to be 12 spaces in front of them, or the highest above 7.
Yeah. In other words, like moving from 6 to 8 is more important than moving from 8 to 10.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. Okay. So anything else we want to talk about on captures? Maybe like relative value of taking an opponent's piece versus keeping your own piece safe.
Right. Yeah. So I think you've done a bit more thinking about this than I have, and the idea is weighing this advantage of getting 20 spaces and knocking someone back with the other things that you could do with your turn.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, when you think about capturing, so yes, it is very nice that you get the 20 extra spaces.
It's very alluring. Yeah.
Yeah. Very alluring to the point where, in my experience, I think it's very rare to see somebody who's able to do a capture who doesn't end up doing that capture. And, to be fair, 20 spaces is like a lot, right? And the important thing to think about is when you take a piece, or a pawn, rather, you're taking the pawn of one of your 3 opponents. So yes, like anywhere from 2 to 4 players can play, but most typically you have 4 players. So you have 3 opponents, and when you take a pawn, you punish one of your 3 opponents. And you get 20 spaces. But basically, if you take a piece and you end up in like a bad position, in other words, let's say you have one pawn that's 6 squares away from another player's pawn, and you have another pawn that, with your current roll can take a different opponent's pawn, or maybe even the same one. I think it's much better and strategically to get the vulnerable pawn of yours to safety than to take that one opponent's pawn. And maybe not, because maybe you can move that pawn out with the 20 spaces. But let's say you can't. Let's say you're closer to your home than 20 spaces away, and you're choosing move this guy or take this guy. And so basically keeping your own pawn on the board, like for sure, is much better for you than removing one of your opponent's pawns from the board. because after all, you're only punishing one of your three opponents. But then if you leave yourself open to be taken, it's not 1 for 1. It's like 1/3 for 1, essentially, because you're taking one from only one of your three opponents and you're losing one sort of to all of your three opponents.
Right. And so I think that it should just be pointed out that maybe our analogies will be a bit clumsy because the game has to do so much with how many spaces, with numbers of spaces, and that's just hard to describe neatly in words. But what Dan's trying to capture is that positioning is everything. Mm-hmm. It's almost maybe better to think of it as, say you have one safe pawn that can capture. You have one pawn that is in danger. Mm-hmm. That will still be in danger if you capture.
Yeah.
Right. In this case, you should probably pass on the capture and prioritize the safety of your pawn.
Right.
One, because given that your pawn won't be able to make it to safety after the capture, that means it's probably close to home.
Right.
It means it's a very valuable pawn. Mm-hmm. And two, it's just this idea of playing a longer, slow game, playing it safe, because as we said earlier, if you play risky, you're likely to play the game indefinitely.
Right.
And almost, not ever make any progress. You have a very small chance of making progress, but you have a very large chance of being knocked back to where you started. Mm-hmm. And so I think what Dan is really trying to bring up with his argument is that flashy moves are not always going to be the best.
Right.
And that it might be boring, but prioritizing your safety should come over getting the most squares immediately.
Yeah. I think you said it best with prioritize the safety of your own pawns. Because obviously, maybe it's the case that with your safe pawn that can take, you take, and then you move your other pawn to safety with 20 squares. But maybe that 20 squares puts it like 6 squares or like within 6 squares from a different piece that can take it. So yeah, it's not a cut and dry thing like you should always take or you should always move your vulnerable pawn away, but in general you should prioritize the safety of your own pawns over the number of squares you gain by capturing a different pawn.
Right, like getting 20 squares does not necessarily improve your position.
Right.
It sometimes you have to use it if you can, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
So it might end up being so that you have to put a piece that's safe into a bad position.
Exactly.
And that's not worth it.
No.
In general, I mean, of course, if you're just feeling really risky, then you go ahead. But I don't think that it's optimal strategy.
Yeah. I mean, odds are over the long haul, it's going to be a losing strategy.
Right.
You're going to be burned more often than you burn someone by doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is a little side note, is that you might want to adapt a more risky strategy if you're coming from behind.
Exactly. Right.
But if it's an even state or even like slightly skewed still, I think it's just best to play it safe because the game's pretty tumultuous. It goes up and down at the tip of a hat. Someone could be doing great until they can't get their final piece out of the starting area for 6 turns and exactly. The tables have turned. That's just what happens.
Yeah. So be in it for the long haul. Don't be flashy unless it makes sense.
Unless it's your only way to win. Yeah. Unless it's like someone else has a very clear unless you're on a time crunch. Yeah. Basically. Yeah. I have to win in 15 or so turns or else I will lose.
Yeah.
Then you make a move like that. But
Yep, exactly. Cool. So anything else we want to say about captures?
No, I think that's all right.
All right. Well, now let's talk about a hot button issue in today's political climate. Let's talk about safe spaces.
Oh, bringing politics into it, I see.
All right. So more specifically, the rules, at least that we have, call them safety spaces. Safety. So These are the spaces that are marked with, like I said earlier, the lotus flower or, the slightly different coloring. Maybe they're blue or orange and the rest of the squares are just white. Anyway, they appear on either side of your home row and right at the bottom of the home row. And then each player has their own safety space, which is where they enter their pawns onto the board.
And that safety space is different than the rest. Because if someone else has their piece, that safety space is essentially only safety for you. Only safe for you. Well, not necessarily. Let me just explain. It works the same as a regular safety space. However, if someone else is on the safety space in front of your starting area and you need to enter a pawn, then you may. And you get to capture the piece that was on the safety space.
Exactly.
And do you get the 20?
You do get the 20.
Okay.
Yep. So, really, I mean, we can talk more about this if you want, but you probably don't want to use your opponent's, like the safety space in front of your opponent's start unless they don't have any pawns in and, are unlikely to get any pawns knocked back into their starting space in the current turn or in the near future.
And if you put a blockade out, they're unable to enter a pawn, yes? If you put a blockade on that space?
Yeah, I believe that is true. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so you've got that that's a little carrot that maybe you do want to use that space if you have the opportunity to put a blockade there. But again, keep in mind everything we said about blockades. It's you have to have something greater in mind than just
blocking their entrance,
making this person really mad.
Because guess what? As soon as you move your blockade, they're guaranteed to have pieces that are ready to come out.
Exactly, and they will be behind you naturally. So yeah, you're really rolling the dice if you do that. But if they have 3 guys in home, then maybe you do want to do that.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about the safety spaces that are not in front of your opponent's starting spots. So my general impression on these is it's generally good to have your pawn on a safe space, and you don't really want to move your pawn off of a safe space if you don't have to. And even better, like if you stay put long enough, then somebody might have the misfortune of moving in front of you or having to move in front of you, in which case they might be easy pickings on your next turn, and then gain you a big 20 square capture bonus. However, again, it's all about positioning, and so this is more or less important depending on your opponent's pawns that are around you. Yeah.
Right. This is, I really don't have anything to add to that. I think just the idea that if you are able to get onto a safe space, you want to hold on to that thing for as long as you can.
Yep.
Or at least until you have a better move. And by better move, I mean a capture that puts you in safety. So because if you sit there long enough, people will pass you. You'll get opportunities to capture. The only problem is you can't sit there forever.
Yeah. Obviously, you're going to have to move at some point. So usually an opportunity to do something cool, will probably come up before that's your last pawn on the board and you're forced to move it. But, again, that as well depends on the position. And if nobody is around you on that safe space, you might as well try and venture forward, maybe get to the next safety space, if depending on what you're doing with the rest of your pawns.
Yeah, if you can advance your piece safely, I guess there is not really as much of a reason to keep it on the safe space. But if there's anyone in the vicinity, even within a couple turns, I would say 2 or 3 turns around you, it's probably best to wait until you can advance it to the next safe space.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So, unless we had any more to say on that, which I don't think we do, we're going to talk about splitting. So Do you want to take this one?
Right. So I think that really this is kind of blended into what we've talked about before. It's all about positioning. But I think that a big part of this game is that you have to make decisions. There's gonna come a time where you can't keep all of your pieces safe.
Yep.
Right. And so I think this kind of applies to splitting pieces. And I like to get your opinion on this, but I would say is that, we've talked about having a play it safe strategy, but there's multiple kinds of play it safe strategies, and I would say that it's best to use your dice in a way that keeps one of your pieces completely safe and maybe risks the other, than leaving both of them in the lurch, but not as much. So I would say almost an all or nothing, keeping your pieces safe.
Sure.
So when it comes to splitting or, moving all the way, I think your choice should be that it shouldn't be preserve the greatest amount of safety for the greatest number.
Yeah.
It should be preserve if you have the opportunity to preserve ultimate safety for one piece, do it.
So really preserve the least possible number of pawns in immediate danger.
Maybe not the least possible, but preserve the first pawn that you'll move the most that you can. And if that requires using both of your dice, do it.
Interesting. So what if, let's say you have two pawns on separate areas of the board that are both, say, 4 spaces away from the nearest enemy pawn, and the nearest enemy pawn is behind you. So pretty likely, maybe like a 1/3 to a 1/2 chance of being taken the next turn. And let's say you roll a 3 and a 4.
Okay.
No, yeah. So maybe that's not a good example. Okay, say they're 6 squares away instead. So
really in the danger zone.
Yeah, right. So basically, they're both really in the danger zone, and you have a 3 and a 4. So do you move one of these guys 7 spaces? So now it's 13 spaces away and out of the danger zone. Or do you move both of these, so 1 3 away, so now it's 9 away. So you've crossed that, initial threshold of 6 spaces away, and now you're in the 7 to 12 less dangerous range. And then the other one you move 4 forward, so now it's 10.
Right.
So
and that's exactly the kind of scenario I was thinking of.
So you think it's better to move the 1 7?
Whichever one's further up, I would move 7.
Okay, because I have a hard time saying I wouldn't split it, because if you have let's just call this a half for example. So you have 2 pieces that are both 6 spaces away, which means they have a 16 and 36 chance of being taken.
Right.
Each one of them does. And so the inverse of that is so you have a 25% chance roughly that they'll both be taken, but if you move one away,
well, and that's more complicated
it's more complicated.
Okay. You can't really narrow it down because there's so much other stuff going on. But I get what you're saying is there's a chance of them both being taken if you do nothing.
Right? But if you move one away, you have a half of chance of them taking one.
Mm-hmm.
If you move them both, then you have what's the 9? A 4 and 36 chance, a 1/9 chance of that one being taken, and then a 3 and 36, so 1/12 chance of the other one being taken. And
Right.
if you add those together, it's much less than 1/2. In fact, it's less than a quarter. And then multiplying it by 2, your expected loss is lower if you do that, right?
No.
So are you making a case that you should not play based on your expected loss?
I think that the scenario you're describing only looks one turn into the future. If you split your dice, you're likely to be chased on both sides. At which point they will be able to maintain 6 spaces, or they will be able to maintain the same odds or pursue you. Whereas if you put both dice into the same piece, you have the chance of outrunning them.
Okay.
So that's one reason why I would make the decision that I do. Another reason is that I think, just kind of going off what we talked about earlier, I'd rather have one piece in my home row and one piece in the starting area than having 2 pieces in decent position.
Okay.
I think that especially early game, putting a piece back in your starting area is not a big deal.
Right. Yeah.
It'll get back out. I mean, you got to do something with those 5s, right?
So, but having a piece guaranteed to not enter your starting area again is huge.
It's huge, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I think it's one of those things where the probability does fail us, because we're obviously not going to look 2 or 3 turns in the future with it.
And obviously, if you really wanted to, you actually could do the math of looking in like 2, 3, 4 ad infinitum turns into the future, and I'm sure there are people who have done that, but we are not those people.
And I don't recommend it.
Yeah, honestly, you have much better ways to spend your time.
Exactly.
But in a pinch, the simple math that we're going through, looking 1, maybe 2 turns into the future is should be plenty to play against your friends or your kids.
Right.
Which is why we're doing this. So,
yeah. So, and I don't mean to say that my opinion is how it should be played. I to be honest with you, I've just come to that conclusion, during the duration of this podcast.
Yeah.
But I think that that's how I would play it, and I would see how it goes. But I just think the idea of I just think you're better off preserving the one a lot than preserving both of them a decent amount.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, we are almost out of time. I mean, technically speaking, we're probably over time, but who's counting? So I think we're going to wrap up.
I hope this guide has helped you in playing Parcheesi, knowing a little bit more about the danger zone.
Yep.
Knowing a little bit more about when and when not to blockade. Knowing the rules.
Yeah.
So you're not
That's huge.
playing incorrectly. And just knowing that not always to take the bait and not always to capture someone.
Oh, yeah. Yep. I think, lots of good takeaways here. So we hope that next time you play Parcheesi with your family or friends or kids, that you apply these rules. And, we can't guarantee that you'll win the first game, but like we said, over time, you should do better than if you didn't know them and apply them. So thanks a lot for listening. Best of luck in your future gaming, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of How to Beat Your Kids at Board Games. We hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something. We always do. If you like our show, please tell your friends and be sure to rate or review us wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by typing our acronym HTBYKABG in the search bar. If you have questions, comments, feedback, or suggestions for games you'd like us to cover, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at htbykabg@gmail.com or message us on social media. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.